Welcome to Pressure Points. Our topic is Google's search business. Some changes are on the horizon. And as of this recording, which is 2 o'clock Eastern time on Wednesday, the 7th, the shares of Google are down just over 7%. At one point today, they were down about 9% on this news. Of course, comments from Eddie Q related to some changes that are happening with search. And I'll I'll start with the punchline here is that I think Google's in a tight spot and I don't know how they get out of this corner. And so I'm going to take a step back and go through what Eddie Q said today at the Google antitrust case, which was that for the first time in Safari, they saw a decline in the number of searches in Safari. Now, if there's any group of people in the world who have a great pulse on what's going on with Google search, it is Apple's management team. And of course, they have this relationship with Google where Google pays them, call it $20 billion a year to be the default search provider. So when Q talks about this search traffic declining for the first time in the month of April, sequentially, that is in reference to effectively Google. Probably 95% of those searches are Google. Surprisingly, you can change the default to things like Yahoo or Bing or Yandex, but the vast majority of people leave it with Google because Google does a great job when it comes to search. And so this is the first time that we have some real detail in terms of what's going on with the impact of generative AI. And the question all along has been, how is Google all along for the last 2 years? How are they going to navigate this? And this is kind of the corner that they're painted into here. So let's talk about the specifics around that. It starts with what's going on with consumer behavior. And of course, we hear a lot about chatbots. We've heard a lot about them for the last few years, but actually the real usage from consumers hasn't really taken off until the past, call it 9 months. And if we use GPT as a proxy, they hit 100 million users, weekly users, late in 2023. So call that 16 months ago. It took them 10 months to go from 100 to 200 million users. And then they went from 200 to 400 million weekly users over 6 months. And so you're seeing faster growth off of a higher numbers. I mean, that's kind of the definition of adoption curve, hitting the sweet spot of the adoption curve. I estimate that they'll probably hit 800 million weeklies. There was some comments from Sam Altman about registered users recently at a TED Talk, but I estimate that they'll hit that 800 million weeklies by the end of June, which means that they went from 4 to 800 million in about 4 months. Now, stick with me here. We're going to convert that 800 million weeklies to daily users to give a apples to apples comparison to what Google has. Probably that 800 million weeklies is probably like 600 million dailies. And that compares to Google search, which at the high end is 2.5 billion daily, and at the low end, 2.1. So call it 2.3 billion dailies. In other words, is that what we have seen so far in this comments of Eddie Q is being impacted by, call it a quarter of the people starting to want this different experience. And this is kind of the cornerstone of my thesis, is that consumers want a simplified search experience. The current Google search experience has 3 pieces to it. At the top, many of them have AI overviews, and then you have blue links, and then you have organic results. Most people will check out the AI overviews or kind of skip the blue links and go down to organic results. But surprisingly, a lot of people click on the blue links, and that's a nice business for Google. It's about, last quarter was 56% of revenue. They do break that out, but they don't break out what percentage of profitability it is. And I estimate that it's closer to 90% of profits. And so this is their golden goose, effectively. And the dynamic, my thesis is that that people are going to want a more simplified experience like generative AI. Now, when you do commerce with generative AI, it doesn't just give you the product to buy. It will give you suggestions about products to buy. And so there, in theory, as Google thinks about ways to combat what is going on with a changing expectation from consumers, one option is they keep doing what they're doing right now, which is medicating the current Google search results page with AI overviews. In my view, it's a suboptimal product because it still is pretty messy. And the second option is that they ditch that whole model and say, let's just go with a simplified model where we give people the answer that they want. In that case, it's a challenge because if you are charging advertisers for that sponsored AI driven result, I think that consumers would question the integrity of that result, just like they jump past the blue links and kind of look at their organic results. And so for them to, if they do that, if it comes out and it's clear that that simple answer that you get from Google's generative simple answer result is influenced by advertisers, then Google risks losing market share. Conversely, if they don't charge for that, they risk losing revenue. And so one option potentially is that they just tear the Band-Aid off and say, we're just going to go to a subscription-based model. Now, if you look at that 2.3 billion users and assume that all of them 100% pay $5 a month, which isn't going to happen, but just for the sake of illustration here, that would be about $140 billion of pure profit. And as it stands today, the search business is going to be about 200 billion in revenue, call it this year, next year, something like that, and account for the majority of the profits. And so even if you go to that $5 a month subscription model and you get 100% adoption, then you still have a challenge in terms of how to grow this. So I don't know what the right answer is. And the more I use Grok and GPT and Gemini, the less I use Google proper. And I think that we're just still in the early stages of that. And so I'm not sure how they get out of this corner. And then I want to so that's the pressure point, is like, how do they get out of that corner? I want to also just make an observation, is that typically when you see businesses that have the kind of momentum that Google has behind it, billions of users, it takes a long time, years, for these businesses to slow down. Businesses that have been much smaller, look at what happened with Yahoo and eBay, Redbox, GameStop. These companies where it's very obvious that their business, the Netflix DVD business, very obvious that those businesses weren't going to be around for the long haul. It still took years, surprisingly amount of time, for them to go away. And what you usually see is these declines like we are experiencing today. And then there's this kind of sense of like the stock is really cheap. It trades at 16 times earnings. The group trades at 25 times earnings. And then you get some stabilization. And then you get a print that actually is okay. Like the search revenue is not as bad as what people thought. And then the stock spikes up. And then people just kind of come back and sell. And it takes 2 or 3 years to kind of unwind. That's what I thought the path that we were on. But Eddie's comments today caught me by surprise that maybe this is happening a little bit faster than what I had been realizing. And so most basic take is that you could see some risk to the Google number, the search number, in the June quarter. The street's currently looking for 9% growth. And since the month of April started out down from the month of March, assuming that this Eddie Q's comment is representative of what's going on in broader Google search, you probably get a number of plus 5 to 7%. And in that case, if they just come in below the 8%, that's going to be negative for Google shares. If they come in above 9%, that would be a big positive. But I think a short-lived positive, as I gave the examples of what happened with some of those other companies. You get this bump up, and then you get people just essentially selling the rip on the quarter because the long term still hasn't been answered. And I'm waiting with bated breath to see how they answer this question, and hope the best for them, because I love their products and just think that this is kind of front and center in terms of companies that are being impacted by the generative experience. On behalf of Pressure Points, I'm Gene. Bye for now.